All right, and so this is actually going to be the last PowerPoint lecture as far as these notes go, mainly because I hit stop instead of pause. So this ties into independent and dependent, or density independent and density dependent limiting factors, okay, because notice it says limiting nutrient. Okay, so by definition, a limiting nutrient in an ecosystem is a single nutrient that's in short supply in that organism's habitat, and so it's going to limit productivity. So when we talk about limiting nutrients, we're typically talking about primary productivity here, okay? And so, for example, we're going to go through this example of algal blooms. So kingdom Protista, this is the kingdom that's all aquatic. It kind of lumps all the leftover organisms together that don't fit into any of the other kingdoms, and algae is a good example of a protist, okay? So in aquatic ecosystems, algae are a lot of your, your producers, your autotrophs, okay? And so, what's called an algal bloom, these are sometimes the result of a particular limiting nutrient suddenly being abundant in a given aquatic ecosystem, right? So how might that happen? We'll get to that in just a minute, okay? So algae is going to typically grow normally. It's going to carry out photosynthesis, making sugars, can serve as food source to organisms that are consumers in the ecosystem, and all is great. And then suddenly, for whatever reason, again, we'll talk about some examples in a minute, then there might be a large input of a limiting nutrient that's added. And so as a result, when suddenly you've got this nutrient that was originally in short supply, then these organisms, okay, algae being the example we're using here, they're going to potentially grow out of control. And so that can lead to, in this case, too much algal growth. You've got a little diagram over here where this is a ton of algae being shown with these fish and these streams, okay? On the left, that is a dead fish that is probably the result of it, or its death is probably the result of an algal bloom specifically. And we'll talk about why that's the case in just a minute. And then here, and that is little man standing there in the water next to what's called a red tide. This is a specific type of protist. It's a dinoflagellate that produces this red coloration. And red tides are essentially where this species has grown out of control. They can be toxic. They get into the muscle of shellfish, okay, like oysters, mussels, and clams. And if you were to consume those, then they produce a nerve toxin, and it can damage your nervous system and kill you if you were to eat that. So typically when we see red tides occur at the beach, and they do happen occasionally, then the shellfishing industry will be shut down. You aren't supposed to swim, and just so things as far as affecting tourists and economy, that there's kind of that trickle-up effect, okay? Well, what could maybe have been the cause of this? Let's say that this is a pond that is near a golf course, and that golf courses like to have really great looking grass for the people that are going to play golf there, and so they use fertilizer. So fertilizers contain limiting nutrients, and that's what they are for, okay? So back when we go to the nitrogen cycle notes, and we said that adding nitrogen to the environment could be because of synthetic fertilizers. Well, when that synthetic fertilizer runs off from the field or the golf course or whatever and into the pond, then suddenly the algae in this case has a boost of the limiting nutrient, okay, with nitrogen in it, and so the algae grows out of control. When farmers or just a backyard gardener like yourself maybe, when they add fertilizer to their crops or your plants you're growing in your backyard, you're adding a limiting nutrient so that you can increase the productivity of that plant so that it will grow more than if you did not add the fertilizer, okay? And so that's essentially a really, hopefully fairly easy to understand example of a limiting nutrient, okay? Single nutrient in short supply that when suddenly there's more of it in the ecosystem, productivity increases, and it can lead to some problems, okay? Sometimes it's not a big deal. Plants grow normally in the farmer's field and not a big deal, but other times it can have some devastating effects. All right, and then I'm just going to stick this on here for just a second. You cannot see this well at all on your PowerPoint notes, and I've got this in here for it to be something that we end up just talking about more in class, hopefully, and if not, then I'll pull it in virtually if that's what I have to do. But this is the very last slide in your notes, and there's a lot going on here, and I just wanted to acknowledge it so that you didn't say, hey, you didn't lecture over this, and more to come. Let me know if you have questions.